Hey Ken, welcome to the show.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely.
It's been great to meet you.
Yeah, likewise. So if you haven't met Ken yet, Kenneth Atchity is a producer known for the movies Hysteria, Life or Something Like It, and Erased. He is an author, producer, literary manager, and editor. His company, Atchity Entertainment, has developed books, screenplays, and films for TV and cinema, and he consults with writers not yet ready for representation. It's great to have you, Ken.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and welcome to everybody on the show too. It's always nice to meet a new audience.
Absolutely. So tell us about your background and how you got started as a writer and in Hollywood.
Well, it's a long story. I got started as a writer at the kitchen table with my mother supervising many years ago, and then I evolved into an editor and book reviewer. When I was 16, I was reviewing books regularly for the Kansas City Star, who didn't know how old I was until they finally called me in and met me, and then they were a little shocked, but they gave me 6 more books to take home with me, and ever since then I haven't looked back. And for years I was writing articles, reviews, and journalistic and academic writing, because I was a professor in my first career for 17 years. And at the end of 17 years, I was just at the point where I wanted to be on the creating side of stories more than on the analytical side of stories. So I started working in the film world, urged by a mentor of mine at the time, and ended up coming up with an idea that was 16 films before it was all over, and never looked back after that. I've now done over 30 films and work in just about every area of entertainment. We've done television, film, and lots of internet stuff, and published books with the traditional publishers. But then a few years ago, when the traditional publishers were all acquired by international conglomerates who cared only about the bottom line, I was having a harder and harder time getting my authors published in New York. So I decided to start my own imprint so that I could get their books out and take books with me to my meetings in Hollywood. And we've set 10 of those books up so far in the last couple of years, published about 150 authors, and still working in New York when there's something that fits their corporate goals, but otherwise just taking it into our own hands and putting the book out and then trying to make a film out of it. So that's kind of the long and short of it.
That's awesome. So, I mean, I would say you're one of the few writers who, you have so much experience, not just in the traditional publishing industry, starting your own publishing company as an editor, but also so much experience in Hollywood, writing for all these movies, helping, your clients, turn their books into movies as well. So I guess my question for you is, what is the kind of the similarities between all the different places you can go to sell a book, right? Because you can sell your book to Hollywood, you can sell it to a publisher, you can self-publish it and sell it directly to readers. What is kind of the overarching, principles that you found that really separate great books from maybe mediocre or good books?
Well, thank you. That's a very articulate and excellent question. I think to start with is to say that I'm in the story business. I'm not in the film business or the television business or the book business. I'm in the story business. And over the years, what I realized is the power of stories, and the power of stories to change someone's life, to make them happier, to make them sadder, to change their thinking. And so all I look at is how to develop a story to its maximum potential, and then how to get it to its maximum audience. And I've learned over the years that the maximum audience is to make a book out of it, and then to make either a feature film or a television film or TV series from the same story. And then you've got an audience on both coasts, and they kind of boomerang. Like one recent film was The Lost Valentine, which first I developed as a book, then sold it to New York in an auction, and it became a New York Times bestseller. And then after years of effort, we got it made into a Hallmark Hall of Fame, starring Betty White. And after it was, in production as a movie, the St. Martin's Press reprinted it as a book, and it went on to sell another couple of 100,000 copies. So that's kind of the ultimate play for a writer, is to get both audiences and then to have them ricochet off of each other. And I've sometimes sold books first and then films, and sometimes film first and then books. And I go back and forth between New York and Los Angeles because that's where the two industries are centralized, and try to leverage the two coasts against each other. And it's worked pretty well in a lot of cases. One of our movies is actually in pre-production this week after 16 years in the trenches of getting made, but it started out as a huge bestseller, New York Times bestseller that Doubleday Bantam put out years ago.
Very cool. So, one of the most common things that I get at the publishing company, when authors are submitting a novel or a story, is they'll say, this book is perfect for film. This book is perfect for a movie or a TV series.
Right.
I hear that all the time. Obviously, it's kind of every novelist's dream to get their story in TV. But how realistic, or in a movie, how realistic is that actually? And how do you actually go about that process as a first-time novelist, a first-time storyteller?
Well, to begin with, watch our workshop, our 20-hour sessions that Daniel and I did called realfasthollywooddeal.com, or buy the book it's based on, Sell Your Story to Hollywood. That's what it's all about. It's me trying to share my experiences the last 20 years and how these stories get sold. And it all starts out with a story that is highly dramatic and has a universal message, something that everybody wants to see or can relate to. So obscure stories that only relate to given population bases, et cetera, are not real good candidates for Hollywood, because Hollywood likes huge audiences. For one thing, the cost of a film is so expensive, it needs to be recouped from the biggest audience possible. And so it starts by looking at the book or at the story and making sure that it has the qualities of a film, which are the basic dramatic qualities that we've known about since ancient Greek tragedy, where we learned about the act structure, about the protagonist and the antagonist, about the development of a character, about the issues, the theme involved in powerful stories, etc. And if a story doesn't have that, but has some of them, then one of my books is called Writing Treatments That Sell, and it shows you how to turn your book into a treatment, which is the chief selling tool in Hollywood. And in that treatment, you can remedy the problems that your book may have had. Let's say you didn't have a huge climactic ending in the book. Well, Hollywood needs big climactic endings, satisfying endings, so that the ticket buyer can walk away thinking, damn, that was really worth it. I love that movie. They didn't even think about the cost of it if they love it. If they don't, they go, wow, what a waste of $12. That's the way we judge it, as we know. So it starts out by creating a treatment that remedies all the dramatic problems and goes through the things that films have to have. And then you take that treatment out to the market and get people enthused about it. I've often sold films based on a treatment and kind of prevented the buyer from reading the book, because the book had so many weaknesses in it. I didn't want the buyer to be discouraged until the deal was closed. Then I reluctantly would turn over the book, because they're going to have to read the book at some point. But by then they're already sold on the movie that the treatment made visible. So that's kind of like the secret weapon of sales in Hollywood is treatment.
Gotcha. So what is the treatment? Can you explain that in more detail?
Yeah, a treatment is a relatively brief written pitch that shows the movie that lies in this story, and does it in the present tense, informal, excited narrative. I always think of it as a letter to your best friend describing what happened when you came home last night and discovered that your spouse was leaving you, and the big knockdown, drag out fight that occurred. In a letter like that, you're not going to be dealing with expository prose or whoever's and moreovers and how, the verities of syntax. You're just going to be letting us see blow by blow what's going on in the present tense, so that we're actually there. And she's sitting on the couch and she's already drunk a gallon of scotch, and she asked me after 20 minutes of screaming at me, ask me if I want a drink. By then, there's almost none left. Just straight ahead prose, not worrying about paragraphing, not worrying about anything other than making, the reader feel the story. And if you can do that, then you basically enlisted them in wanting to make a movie out of this story.
Gotcha. And so who would you actually send this treatment to? Who, if you're a first-time novelist, you want to go make your break in Hollywood, who would you actually reach out to?
You would reach out to a representative or some kind of a contact in Hollywood. Because Hollywood is, like the publishing world, a very inside game. It's kind of a club of people who have made movies, and there are thousands of hangers-ons of people who have not made movies but want to make movies. And the people who have made movies have one thing in common, which is that they are bombarded by storytellers. And the irony of it is that we all want great stories. We're looking for them. But the sad part is that so many bad stories are being hurled at us that we tend to get protective. And that's why the gatekeepers are number one enemy of the would-be novelist who wants to sell a story. And the question is, how do you get by the gatekeepers? And that happens when a representative who these gatekeepers have dealt with for years and years takes your story to them. I take stories to lunch several times a week and to dinners and pitch them and have the book with me or have the treatment with me. And if somebody gets excited by the pitch, then I hand it over and they take a look at it seriously. So that's how you do it. You find a representative to take it in for you.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. So you want to build your network of someone who's already got an in, essentially. And
right. And if you're living in Oklahoma City or, Kissimmee, Florida, it's not impossible to find these people because there are writers' conferences all over the country, and there are all kinds of conferences for writers. And many times you'll discover that some of the very people you'd be targeting are at those conferences making presentations or listening to stories. So you need to get on an airplane and go there and hunt them out. And if you're lucky, find them at the bar and, buy them a drink, and, otherwise just sign up for a conference with them. And then you suddenly have a personal contact and ask for their advice. I mean, I always say that one of the secrets of success is not to ask people to give you things or to buy things from you, but to ask their advice. Because the people who've succeeded, if you ask their advice, they're not going to be shy if it's something they want, right? They're going to tell you that. But if it's not something they want, they still might help you and give you an invaluable entree to someone that can help you. It's not costing them anything to offer advice. So it's the best approach possible at a conference or anytime you get the good fortune of having a personal contact with them. Just ask them to, I love to talk to you. Don't offer to buy them a free lunch because they don't need a free lunch. You know what I mean?
Right.
But just ask them if you could take 5 minutes of their time to ask, point you in a direction that would make sense to you. Because all of them have been where you are now at one point in their lives. And almost everybody who's gotten ahead at all has gotten ahead because somebody stopped and gave them a hand along the way. So they're not upset when you ask them for advice. It's much more pressure when you ask them to buy your story or, to make your story. But just to say, can you help me out, is a great way to approach them, I think.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And so what would your advice be to someone to making a pitch? In other words, what do you say? Like, when you're pitching your story, if you had 30 seconds to pitch a story, how would you pitch it?
Well, I would pitch it in the same kind of a line that I pitch a best friend who says, have you seen any good movies lately? And you say something extremely brief to them, maybe a sentence or two, describing the story that you've recently seen that you love. And this is called the log line in Hollywood, the one-line summary of the story. And when you have that log line, that can get their attention. Some people call it an elevator pitch. You catch a guy in an elevator and you've got 15 seconds of his attention before his floor comes. and you tell them the story. Like, would you be interested in a story about a guy who got stuck in an apple tree and during a hurricane? And, this is what happens. And you just give it to him in a few words. And, one of the basic things about storytelling is that if you can't reduce your story down to a few words, then there's something wrong with your story, almost certainly. Do you know what I mean?
What do you mean by that?
Because all good stories have a reduction mode in which you can just tell them what the story's about. Like the famous example of a Steven Seagal movie called Under Siege that was made years ago. It was sold as Die Hard on a boat. It's Die Hard, but on a boat, on a ship. And that was all it was taken to sell it. And Splash, when you come to pitch the movie Splash, it's a fish out of water story, only she's a mermaid. That also works for The Little Mermaid. And if you can reduce it down like that, then people get intrigued by the story right away. But if you have to go on and on for paragraphs to describe the story, their mind wanders, they're not listening anymore, and they're wishing you good luck and can't wait to get out of the elevator,
Right.
They like something that catches their attention simply and briefly. And then if you're in a pitch meeting where you actually get a chance to pitch an executive or an agent, it's always better. The less, the better. Less is better, because you want them to draw you out and ask questions. Well, wait a minute. You said he was this. Like, how old is he? And blah, blah, blah. They're asking you questions. The minute they start asking questions, they're interested. And if they ask you 5 questions, they're virtually invested in your story already. But if you tell them too much, they're gonna, you're gonna lose their attention. It's much better to invest them and have them ask questions.
Well, that's a great point. I think it probably applies to almost any conversation with another human being, right? Because, I've noticed so many times that, at a party or something where someone's talking to you, and if it's someone who's talking and just talks for 10 minutes and you can't get a single question in, even if it's stuff you're interested in, it's not nearly as entertaining and exciting for you if they just talk for 20 seconds, then you you ask a question, and then, you go back and forth, and, you get to direct the conversation a little bit. And
absolutely.
Great principle for any kind of human interaction.
Exactly. And it brings up a really good point about show business. The most important character, as I tell all of my writers for years, in a story is the audience. It's a character that you normally wouldn't even think is a character in the story. But it is a character in the story. And if you lose the audience at any point in the story, then what's the point of telling the story? There is no point. Right? So you have to structure the story for the audience. You have to keep watching the audience's eyes. If you're live, in front of an audience, you know how that is. You can see their eyes. And if they're not laughing, then you better have a good follow-up to figure out why they're not laughing. Like one of my favorite ones is, that was just a test. Thank God you didn't laugh, because I would have really lost my respect for you. But and then you get a little laugh, because it shows you're communicating with them. And so the audience is what you have to watch. And if the problem with your friend at the party is that he doesn't care about the audience. He's just so wrapped up with himself that he isn't even watching your face or recognizing that you're looking at the bar because you'd like to have a drink, and he's not giving you a chance to do that. So he isn't a good teller of his own story. And there are many cases in my career, I have gone to pitch meetings with writers who have sabotaged their own pitch because they don't stop talking. It's a famous mistake that salesmen make. Like, stop selling when your customer is already sold. And you can tell someone's sold if you're paying any attention to them, and if you're listening to their questions, you can tell they're sold. But writers keep talking out of insecurity or whatever. Keep talking, and they unsell the story. So sometimes I will tell the writer, look, we've tried 3 meetings now. They've all been screwed up. And I know it's not your fault, whatever, but I'm going to sell this story without you. I'm going to go in there and sell the story for you because that's my job, and I don't want you to screw it up. And I many times sold a story that the writer couldn't sell. I'll never forget one famous example. I was partnered with Warner Brothers. I'd gone to Warner Brothers to get them to finance this wonderful story based on a famous novel that we optioned, and brought the author out to Los Angeles to prepare the pitch. We were going to go to all the top television companies to pitch this. And Warner Brothers wanted to rehearse all these pitches, although I don't really believe too much in rehearsals, because the performance you give in front of the guy who can write the check is got to be completely different from the performance you give to practice that performance, right? But nonetheless, it makes studios feel better to have these kinds of warm-up sessions. But one thing I told the writer, whatever you do, just look the guy in the eye and tell him your story. Don't read anything. Don't look anywhere else. Just look at him. Tell him the story. And sure enough, to my utter dismay, we walked into the office of the head of HBO, one of the most powerful guys in show business. And this author pulls out a stack of 3x5 cards, in which I suppose he had his story outlined, a story that he had published a best-selling novel on, right? And this executive, whose name I won't mention because it's such a scary story, said, "Excuse me, what are those?" And he said, "They're just little reminder cards." And he goes, "Are you fucking kidding me?" Excuse my language. He said, "You've got to be kidding me. You're trying to get me to spend $20-30 million on a movie, and you don't even know the story by heart, and you wrote the book? Get out of my office. Get out of my office." And that was the end of the meeting. And I guess I hope this guy learned a lesson. It was a painful lesson. But I totally understood the executive. He's saying this is about humanity. I mean, there's one famous example of Sam Goldwyn, who had supposedly an assistant who came in, and the only way he bought stories is if she could come in and pantomime it for him. So she would come in, he would lock the office door by a remote button, and she had 60 seconds to pantomime the story that they were trying to sell. And he said, if my ass burned during the pitch, I acquired the story. If I felt nothing, I just dismissed it. And it's kind of a crass, primitive way of describing what storytelling is all about. It's all about capturing the audience in a relationship with you that leaves the whole rest of the world out. It's just you and the audience, and they're living in your story. And that's why it's so important not to have anything in the story that takes them out of the story. You know, if you introduce a character in Act 3 that wasn't in the earlier part of the story, you've suddenly taken your audience out of the story and killed your story. But the most important thing is to keep the audience on the edge of their seat all the way through the pitch. And if you can do that, then you have a good chance of selling your story.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And it sounds to me like the principle here is really, it's all about like human interaction, right? Which is essentially what a movie is anyways. It's, people on a screen and you're interacting with, these people. And so, it's interesting to me that you talked about, the log line, you only need one sentence to pitch a story. And then essentially you're just sharing a conversation from that point on. And it sounds to me like, I could come up with 25 log lines, and easily, like right now, I could just write down a whole bunch of different ideas for stories. And so it doesn't even sound like you need a book to sell a story to Hollywood.
Well, that's a very good point to bring up, because it's ideas. You're talking about selling an idea to Hollywood, and we say out here all the time, ideas are a dime a dozen. In fact, that's probably generous, but it's not ideas that end up making movies. It's the execution of the idea. It's the storytelling, not just the story. If you are a famous writer who, like, Eli Roth, who that everybody knows he's going to deliver a great script, you can probably sell a story. James Cameron sold Terminator in the room just by telling the story, and they greenlighted the movie because he's a good storyteller, and he knew how to write. So, but if you're not in that room, if you're, in Oklahoma or Texas or someplace, how are you going to do that? You've got to execute it by either writing a good book or writing a great treatment or getting a screenplay written. That's what they're going to look at, because there isn't, there aren't any new stories. We keep, as humans, we keep telling the same story over and over again, century after century, millennium after millennium. But it's how you tell the story that makes all the difference in the world. Like, this story sounds familiar. It's about a father who has 3 daughters, and they're always at war with each other. And then suddenly he finds a way to get them all to pay attention and be nice to each other by telling them he's going to leave them his fortune, but only under certain conditions, etc. And then you suddenly realize you're in the middle of a retelling of King Lear, which in itself was a retelling of another story. Shakespeare was famous for retelling stories from the Italian Renaissance or from the Greeks or the Romans. So it's all a question of execution. A good story is almost a dangerous thing to have because you can't protect it. An idea can't be protected. Only a written document can be protected. So you can protect it. If you have a great idea like that, at least write it as a treatment, because then you can protect it with the Writers Guild, and you have some protection. Otherwise, you're basically, in my opinion, wasting your time coming up with ideas, because nobody's looking for ideas. They're looking for, and it's not like we're not drowning in ideas here in Hollywood. I mean, we get hundreds of pitches every day. We get 10,000 scripts floating around town every year. So we're not hungry for ideas. We're hungry for good stories, good, well-educated, well-executed stories, like The Hunger Games. I mean, you can see the power of those novels. Suddenly you can see the movie in them, and suddenly somebody in the film business gets hold of them, and next thing you know, it's a trilogy, 3 or 4 movies. Same with Twilight, and same with so many other, and they never get old. I mean, right now, David Lynch, who's somebody we know because we're giving him an award this year, David Lynch is redoing Twin Peaks as a TV series, and he's already done that several times, but it's now years later, and the world has changed, and it's time for a new generation to see that story in a new way. So he's doing it, and that's the great thing about stories. They never get old. They keep giving and giving and giving. So yeah, I get excited about the whole thing because I believe that the human race runs on stories. I mean, during a presidential election, it's all a question of whose story do you believe? Do you believe her story? Do you believe his story? In the middle of a court, you've got one attorney arguing against the other. Whose story do you believe? Do you believe that she really did kill her boyfriend? Or do you believe that that's just impossible, that she's a victim of circumstance, that she was abused, etc.? So one attorney tells one story, the other one tells another story, and the jury is like the audience. They're sitting there in the theater deciding which story they believe. If you're on a first date, you walk away going, the trouble is, I just don't believe his story. So if you don't believe his story on the first date, it's not likely to get any better, and your friend's going, forget about it. Forget about it. I can tell you his story sounds fishy from here. And we when we're trying to buy a product, we're listening to the stories on television, and when we go to the car showroom, we're listening to the salesman tell us the story. And if he oversells it, then we start getting suspicious. So we're all very sensitive to stories because we base our lives on stories. And you can have all the logic you want. You can have all the expository essays that you want, but at the end of the day, somebody tells you a little story. That's what you're going to remember, and that's what's going to make your mind up, is that story. That's what politicians are always telling you, these childhood stories of, like, when I was only 12, I sat by the fire, and because there was no light, and I had to read by the fire, etc. And I studied law books that way, and I could barely see, and that's why I had to wear glasses by the time I was 15. And oh, really? Yeah. So they either buy your story or they don't buy your story. So storytellers to me are almost like a sacred vocation. In the ancient times of Homer, when we didn't even have books, the storyteller went from village to village telling stories, and people remembered the past and heroes and who did what and what happened to somebody who did a bad thing, all through their memory of stories, and they passed these stories along. It's our primary way of holding reality together, I think, is telling stories to each other. So yeah, I get excited about it, and I feel enormously privileged to have spent a lifetime just working in this world of stories.
Absolutely. I mean, I totally agree. I mean, stories are kind of foundational to society, to human civilization. We've been telling stories since before we even really had written language, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, there were those who went out on the hunt and those who stayed in the cave and told the stories, and they became so valuable that they didn't want them to risk themselves on the hunt. No, you stay here and keep doing your drawings on the walls and telling us stories, because we recognize that the storyteller in Homeric times, the storyteller was on a par with kings. He was the one guest who everyone would honor and protect him with their life and feed him for an indefinite amount of time as long as he stayed in the court, etc., because he was performing a sacred role in keeping society together by telling them these old stories. They recognize that as far back as then. And today, storytellers who are successful are still honored and respected. And of course, until they're successful, they just have to fend for themselves. It's a jungle out here, right?
Right, absolutely. I mean, that's the common myth, right? Is that, to be an artist, to be a storyteller, to be a writer, to be, a screenplay writer, you have to be broke. You have to be a starving artist, right?
Yeah, I really hate that starving artist thing, because it means that you're impotent and that you don't have any ability to change your own environment. You need to do whatever you need to do in order to continue telling your stories until the world is paying you for your stories. It's like having enough money to play at the craps table. If you don't have the money to make the bet, you can't play. So you need to go get that money and then come back and play.
Right. Well, it's like the starving artist story is itself a story, and it's a bad story, right? Like if that's a story you have about yourself.
It's a self-defeating story. It's a self-sabotage story. It's a poor me story. It's a victim story. And we've all had enough of victims and poor me. And yeah, we don't like that story.
Right. I mean, no one will watch that movie, right? They want to watch the movie about someone who overcomes, right?
The other thing is that, people in your family, for example, think you're crazy if you want to be a writer or a musician or, an actor or, God forbid, a dancer. They just think you're crazy. And I ran across years ago something that the great painter Salvador Dali said: the difference between myself and a madman is that I am not mad. And that is a statement that only an artist could have made. It's a brilliant statement, and only a successful artist. Because as far as everybody's concerned, he is crazy if he's hanging out in his garage filled with paintings and drinking weird stuff and having 3 wives or 4 wives at a time and doing whatever else is kind of crazy. He's crazy. But the minute they wake up and see in the paper that one of his paintings sold for $1 million, he's no longer crazy. He's a genius, and it takes a split second for him to move from crazy to being a genius, right? And then you say, I always knew he was a genius. I always knew. Everybody else is calling him crazy, but deep down, I could see it coming. I'm not surprised. This is the world that writers and artists have to live with, the world where overnight the world can think you're a genius when before they thought you were crazy, gave you no respect. And the way you get over that is you just have to keep writing. All that you really care about if you're a writer is your writing. The stories you're telling and the craft that you're developing as you tell these stories, that's all you care about. That's what makes you happy. That's the eternity. That's the immortality. Doing that. Everything else can be miserable. You could live like a dog, but in those moments that you're actually working at your computer on a story, you're timeless, you're eternal, you're royalty. So the writer should never forget that his calling is his chief blessing and happiness, and that everything else is secondary, and he should just keep it all in perspective. Have perspective and a sense of humor, and keep writing. Ray Bradbury said once at a conference I was at, start writing more, it'll get rid of all these moods you're having. And I thought that is a great statement, because anybody who's a writer knows that you sit down and start writing and suddenly things feel better. And they may feel like really horrible when you're not writing, when you're listening to somebody. Like I used to give a class called at UCLA called Keeping Your Spirits Up. And I had one time a whole bunch of actresses in the class, and I said, let's go around the circle on the first day of class and introduce yourself and tell me, what is the one question you hate to hear the most, and how do you answer it? So the first actress said, Geez, the question I hate to hear the most is, when are you going to move back to Detroit and work in the post office? And I said, oh my God, that's a bad one. And what do you usually do? And she said, I usually just run out of the room crying, leave the party, you know? So I said, well, we need to work on that. This is definitely a problem. So the next actress, I said, what about you? And she said, the question I hate the most is, what have you been in big lately that I've seen? And I said, oh my God, yeah, that's a familiar question. And I said, how do you answer? And she goes, I say, the Pacific Ocean. And, you know, that instantly breaks the ice, cracks people up, makes her laugh, and everybody loves her. So I thought, here's the difference between these two artists, right? One of them is not figured out their brain yet. They haven't figured out their art. They haven't figured out their mind. And they haven't figured out how to protect themselves from the insensitivity that we're all surrounded with, most of which is unintentional. It's just insensitivity. But the other one has got it all figured out, and she's not about to subject herself to vulnerable situations that can reduce her to leaving the room in tears or whatever. She's going to stay in that room, and here's how she did it. She came up with an answer that puts her back in control. And that's what every writer has to do, is to come up with an answer to whoever it is who's making all these comments. I wrote a book once called Quit Your Day Job and Live Out Your Dreams. And it talks about how to distinguish between friends, friendly associates, family, supporters, and all the different kinds of people in your life. And basically, the artist's job is to rebuild their circle, to rebuild their family, so that as the years go by, your family are the people who've been supporting you for years, who are your friends, who, even if they aren't supporting you, are not ever judging you or criticizing you or trying to hold you back. And you may end up leaving behind much of your natural family, none of whom are doing that for you. Too many of them are going, you're nuts. When are you going to move back to Kansas City and, get a real job? Like a real job. There's a real job going to the bank every day and being a teller. I don't know. To me, that doesn't sound real. But to most people, it does. And I can't be most people. I have to be with my own kind of people,
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And I love, this kind of metaphor of, you have to have your story that you're writing, your book, your movie, you have to have that story down and nailed, but you also have to have your personal story down and nailed, which is that, I'm an author, I'm an artist, I'm a screenwriter, I'm a, movie writer, whatever. And this is what I do. This is my passion, and I'm going to make it work. And you have to be able to not just sell people on the story that you're creating, but to sell them on your own story, which is
right.
You're a person who's actually worth listening to.
Right, and you're not the guy who's going to burst into tears every time someone asks you a question. Nobody has time for somebody who needs to be psychoanalyzed at every single dinner party, right? We all know those kinds of people. And I remember once we had a dinner party and an actress was there who I hadn't seen before. And at one point in the party, she just said at the top of her voice, "I demand attention now." And it, the women hated her, by the way, for saying that. But the guys laughed because it was, she got our attention. And it was like a cool way to do it as far as men were concerned. And we listened to her, and, she didn't have a lot to say, but nonetheless, we loved her for making, that comment. And that just showed that she knew how to carry herself around doing these things. And the other thing is that you don't really want everybody to get into your personal story if you're a writer. You don't have time. It's not the story you want to tell. You want to tell the story you've got in your head that you're working on. And so you come up with a kind of pat story that you can give, and it dismisses the whole issue of who you are, from the air, so you don't have to deal with that anymore. I was once at a party, and I'll never forget this. It was hilarious. One of my students introduced me, and they said, "This is my professor, Ken Atchity. He's a writer." And it was a producer she was introducing me to. And the producer says, "Oh, you're a writer. Say something in writing." And I thought, I love that. That is hilarious. He had his own comeback to a kind of stupid introduction, because I hate being introduced as a writer. I mean, okay, say something in writing. At the beginning of one of my books, I say, writers write. That's all they are. They write. When they're not writing, they're not writers. There's something else. They're speaking, they're talking on the phone, they're working out, they're playing tennis. But when they're writing, that's when they're writers. And I don't put a lot of stock in the word writer or the word author. I put it in the word storyteller. Because if you're a storyteller, I want to hear your story. And if you get me with your story, then I want to hear more stories from you.
Mm-hmm.
And I have one storyteller, God, I've worked with him for 25 years, and I can't wait to start reading his next story. He just is such a great storyteller. And he hasn't made any money all these years, but it doesn't stop him, which is another proof that he's a great storyteller. And I'm always trying to do something like this morning, I talked to a director who's agreed to write the script based on one of his stories. I haven't even told him that yet. But it made me so extremely happy because this poor guy has been working for all these years without any reinforcement except from me. And I know that he's dying for the world to give him some proof that he knows what he's doing, but he just keeps doing it. And he tells me when we have dinner, he goes, I can't stop doing it. That's just who I am. I said, well, that is your greatest redemption. And thank God you're that way, because if you were basing it on your success or basing it on, I'll keep writing until X happens, or I'll, put a deadline on it of some sort, you're never going to make it. This takes crazy ambition, crazy determination, and simply persisting until you can't persist anymore. You
Absolutely.
keep going. You keep going. I mean, you're living a dream life if you're a writer, because you're doing what everybody wished they had the guts to be doing or wish they could do. And if you are leading a dream life, you should be recognizing the beauty of that dream. And if you die before you've achieved any external fame, so what? You died in the middle of a dream. And what is more happy death than that? And if you succeed in the dream, all you're going to do is have a bigger dream and keep going in another way. But I think that writers need to embrace what they're doing as the most important thing in their lives. Their writing is the most important thing, and that needs to be protected and defended and honored for what it is. Celebrate the fact that you're writing, and you don't need anything other than a pencil and a piece of paper sitting in the middle of a busy market, and you can be writing. So I write on planes, on buses, on trains, wherever I am. I've never had to worry about writer's block, because to me, writer's block is not knowing what you want to write. And my rule is never sit down to write until you know what you're going to write before you sit down. So just think about it and then sit down and write it, and there's no problem. So I think it's exciting to be in this world and to see how different writers do it, and to see how they persist and keep going. And the greatest ones just keep going.
Absolutely.
And they use whatever they have to use. In Faulkner's case, it was a bottle of whiskey. That's what he needed. That's what he used. In Coleridge's case, it was opium. He used opium and wrote Kubla Khan and other great poems. And you don't have to be addicted to something to write, but whatever it takes. The good thing about writing is it's not based on a religious adherence. It's not based on a certain form of morality. We've had every kind of writer, from the most holy ones to the most profligate ones, and everywhere in between. And it's all because they're all talking the human story, and there's room in the human story for everything.
Absolutely. Right. You need both the highs and the lows. You need everything to make a story. You can't just have just a good hero and protagonist and no villain. I mean, it just makes a boring story.
There's a great line from a play by Plautus, a Roman playwright, by a character named Chremes. He says at one point in the play, I am a man, nothing human is alien to me. And I always love that statement, because it really defines the mindset of a writer. Like, whatever is human, I want to explore it. I want to figure it out. I want to deal with it. Writers don't like being pigeonholed or tucked into a niche somewhere. They want to experience everything that humans can experience. And that's why I admire them, and applaud their commitment to what they're doing, and try to, I've spent my life trying to help them get their stories perfected and then out to the world, to the best audiences we can get them to.
Absolutely. Well, definitely agree with that. I mean, I think one of the signs that I've noticed with really great storytellers, with really great writers, is that they're always studying humans, right? They're so fascinated by humanity, by the highs and the lows, by the hatred and love, by, everything that goes into the human experience, from, Hitler to the Dalai Lama, this whole spectrum of what we call good and evil, right? And humanity. And if you're not studying that stuff, it's really hard to tell a great story because you're not connected. Like if you don't know about how dark and, horrible humans can be, it's hard to write a great story about how dark and terrible humans can be if you haven't really experienced and thought about it,
Right. I mean, everything from Breaking Bad to Orphan Black to Scandal to Orange is the New Black. I mean, you see everywhere you look, writers probing all of human experience and bringing it to us, and audiences love it because audiences love it too. They want to see it, but they aren't the probers. They're the ones who get to observe it. They're the ones that go to the theater and experience it vicariously. And that's why I hate any kind of censorship or trying to block certain forms of expression. Just seems really, really wrong. I mean, thank God we live in a country that at least the laws of it say that we have freedom of expression, even though in reality, our freedom is constantly being restricted by everything from political correctness to fanaticism. And we've got to fight that always. We've got to continue fighting and never stop, because that's what this country was based on. And it's what, in a perfect world, that's what the whole world would be doing, is being free to express anything in order to explore, what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong, what works, what doesn't work, what has meaning, what doesn't have meaning. I mean, that's the excitement of being alive.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, it is a fascinating world we live in, and it's so much fun to be a storyteller. And this has been a great interview, Ken. I really appreciate all the wonderful insights you share with us. And I know our listeners would love to hear more about you and the work that you're doing, and where they can learn even more about, maybe getting some of their stories into Hollywood.
Well, I'm always working on many things. I've got several movies that are very close to being finally funded that we've been developing for years, and a couple of animation movies, a war movie, a franchise, a huge children's franchise, and just closing a deal with the studio right now on a true story that is a thriller about a man who went underground to track down the killers of his brother and bring them to justice. So working on all of these things, and at the same time publishing some great books that I get very excited about. And so I'm working all day on reading stories, developing stories, and dealing with attorneys about stories. The legal work is constant. I mean, there's no day goes by I don't have at least an hour on the phone with several attorneys, which tells me how exciting the world is, right? Because people really care about stories to the point where they will argue for weeks. One deal's been negotiating for 9 months because its attorneys won't give up, and they're fighting over every little point because stories are so valuable. So this is what I get to do all the time. I'm always looking for new stories, and I'm particularly interested in helping others, educating them about the world in which stories are sold. I knew I was onto something when I left the academic world, which was supposed to be the world of ideas, and came into this world of show business, where ideas are, bought and sold at millions of dollars, and are, stolen and are copied, and everything you can imagine. It's a jungle of stories, and it's all about, it's so powerful that there's even a group of people called trackers, if you can believe this. That's their official name, and all they do is track stories. And I get calls every week saying, are you in control of the rights of such and such a story? And I say, yes. Why do you ask? And they go, well, we're working for a client. Who's the client? Oh, I can't identify that. But thank you. I just needed to verify that. Goodbye. So all the big studios hire these people, the big producers, the directors, and they're just tracking stories. So I think, gee, that, this is the world of ideas. This is the world where stories really matter. And that's exciting. And I loved introducing people to that and finding a story that can be in that kind of exalted world where stories are bought and sold for millions of dollars. That's our favorite thing to do. And the satisfaction of getting a movie made finally is enormous. It's worth all the pain. I mean, it's the most masochistic career you could ask for. But fortunately, I was raised Catholic, and masochism is my middle name. So, I'm perfect for this world.
That's great. So where can people connect with you online, Ken, and learn more about you?
Probably the best way is my website, storymerchant.com, Story Merchant. And I also have a blog site, kenatchity.blogspot.com. But Story Merchant is probably the best way. You can then go from there to other websites of mine and stop in at Real Fast Hollywood Deal and take the free webinar, and you'll learn a lot of these things in detail. And so I'm not that hard to find. And we're looking for good stories. We like log lines first. We don't want to hear all about your life. That's not the important thing. The important thing is, what is your story? And we can learn about you later if we love your storytelling. So I wish everybody good luck, and I really enjoyed talking with you, and happy to do it anytime. And, if you have a specific subject to talk about, I'm here.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Ken. I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thank you, Tom. I look forward to it. Take care. Bye-bye.